Will Russia invade Ukraine? Are you wondering why Russia is massing a military force bigger than most of the armies on the planet on its border with the Ukraine? Is Russia about to invade and seize the most eastern parts of the Ukraine? Who's responsible for this serious and dangerous crisis? Stay tuned to get the real answers. Welcome to the World Econ News. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification button to get all the new updates. The Russian armed forces have been massing along the Ukraine border. Satellite images proved beyond any doubt that the Russian army has been, in the past few months and more aggressively in the past 2 months, on the move and positioning what can only be described as an invasion-capable force along the Ukrainian border. A force that is large and equipped enough to overrun the poorly equipped Ukrainian defenses in days. The location of most of the new massing Russian troops is quite interesting because they are not all that close to Ukraine's border. In fact, they're located tens of kilometers and up to 160 kilometers inside Russian territories, and are not all entirely newly deployed since Russia already maintains a heavy military presence in the area and has for a very long time. But what's new is a few mechanized divisions that include hundreds of tanks and self-propelled artillery units that were recently deployed in war games near the Ukrainian border, but did not retreat to old positions that are deeper into Russia after the war games ended. It's not only that these military hardware pieces and tens of thousands of military personnel remained in the new positions, but new additions are arriving on a steady basis in small patches. Russia maintains that it's not interested in invading Ukraine, and such a concept is just ridiculous and mere propaganda by the Western governments and their mainstream and non-mainstream media alike. Russian President Vladimir Putin clarified further that these forces are a natural response to increased NATO provocations in the Black Sea. Their increased funding, arming, and training of Ukrainian troops attempts to establish a strong NATO presence in the Ukraine close to the Russian border, and the American long history of attempting to expand its missile defense and defense capabilities closer to Russia. Putin also made it clear to the world in a recent interview that the West should throw Ukraine's application to join NATO in the garbage bin because the consequences could be as bad as World War III. He literally said World War III. You can't make this stuff up. The answer is very simple. Do not give them a reason and justification. You might think that it's Russia that must take the decision to invade the Ukraine and seize the region of Donbass and other areas to create its eastern borders by creating a buffer zone. But the answer is quite far from that. It's up to NATO and the USA to make the decision on behalf of Russia. Sounds very confusing, right? Well, it's not. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has been following a strict doctrine of never getting involved in any sort of invasions for the purpose of expanding its territories, and it's been following this doctrine religiously until 2014, when it broke its own rules and annexed Crimea in the southern Ukraine right after a Western-backed Ukrainian revolution that ended with a new Western government in Kiev and the separation of the region of Donbass, which continued to be a hotspot. A battleground between Western-backed Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian nationalists, or rather separatists, who prefer closer ties with Russia. The status of Donbass and Crimea have been a huge endgame factor that increased NATO and US meddling in Ukrainian affairs on one side and direct Russian military mobilization in recent years. The Ukrainian Revolution of 2014 was littered with serious NATO, American, and Western European political provocations, and military games mobilization in the Black Sea that is more aimed at achieving geopolitical goals than helping the people of the Ukraine reap the results of the revolution and start a new era. So how soon can Russia invade the Ukraine? Well, it can do it now, and it can occupy a quarter of Ukraine and secure it within days. And guess what? The whole world will do squat all. NATO and the USA will merely impose sanctions on Russia and capitalize on the situation to weaken Russia internally and on the international stage, while dispatching more military gear and funds for the Ukrainian armed forces. However, Russia is still massing its troops without a set final goal nor decision. It's dealing with the situation as a war game and is preparing for all possible scenarios. Nevertheless, experts agree that the Russian buildup will be more ready for the invasion in January or February of 2022, using the harsh cold winter as a cover, since its entire army is trained to fight in meters of snow with temperatures as cold as the North Pole. When Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, the world watched in silence and dismay, with plenty of media coverage. The action represented a serious blow to NATO and the West in general. Russia, an undisputed world superpower, proved to the world that it will not hesitate to use force in securing its borders and keeping NATO and the USA at bay in any regions that represent strategic, geopolitical, or geo-economic importance. The Russian intervention in Syria is an example. No, Russia can't afford to invade and occupy Ukraine for several reasons, such as the size of the Ukraine and the costs of keeping it under military control. The US and UN sanctions to follow any invasion will affect Russia's interest in Europe, oil and gas exports to be specific. Any invasion is bound to have some setbacks and bad economical effects that ought to weaken Putin's image back home. He's currently very popular and loved by the majority of the Russians. NATO and the USA will reignite the flames in Syria, where Russian troops are on the ground working with Assad forces. Syria is home to Russia's only naval base in the Mediterranean Sea. Relations between NATO's heavyweight Turkey and Russia will deteriorate. Keep in mind that the Russian Navy cannot access the Mediterranean Sea without passing through the Bosphorus Straits, which is located in Turkey. The Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which stretches from northern Russia to Germany in the Baltic Sea, is completed, and once the German regulators give the green light for it to operate, it can give the Russian economy a serious and much-needed boost. An invasion would put it on permanent hold, and finally, East European nations will panic and run west. The Turkey factor. Turkey has been a member of NATO since 1953. Its contribution to NATO as a military force is only second to the USA. Indeed, the Turkish army is not a force to be tested, but it's also an Islamic country and a rising manufacturing giant that is competing with France, Germany, and the UK. Which explains why the EU rejected admitting it to the Union. Turkey does not interfere in the movement of ships in the Bosphorus Straits, which connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, but it can and has restricted the movement of military ships, which gives it a big say on what happens in the Black Sea, at least militarily. It's also sold sophisticated military gear to Ukraine, including state-of-the-art drones and technologies. Meanwhile, it's also had some pretty good business and political deals with Russia. For example, Russia is currently building Turkey's first nuclear reactor. One of the main Russian gas pipelines that feeds the US runs through Turkey. Russia also provided it with the 400 defense system. There's something else you should know. Turkey hosts an American nuclear weapons base where the USA holds a few hydrogen bombs. So what does all this mean? It means that Turkey is a major wild card in this crisis. Whoever wins Turkey's graces now will win the upcoming battle in the Black Sea and Ukraine, if that battle ever started in the first place. Let's cross our fingers and hope that the superpowers will cool down and play nice. There is plenty to go around. So what will Russia do? Experts from all sides agree that if NATO and the USA continue to provoke Russia in the Black Sea, and by waiving the possibility of admitting Ukraine to NATO, and if the USA doesn't lift the sanctions on corporations involved in the Nord Stream 2 project and doesn't stop blocking the Germans from bringing it online, the Russian forces are likely to seize Donbass and other areas near its border and declare them Russian territory, just like they did in the Crimea. This scenario is harsh, and in reality, none of the players want to go there. Is it difficult for Russia to run a limited operation in the Ukraine? No, it would be easy to achieve since the population in these regions consider themselves Russians. There would be no resistance. Sadly, and you won't like what you are about to hear, A Russian partial invasion would be considered acceptable by the USA, which wants Europe, Eastern Europe to be specific, to move away from Russia even more and jump into its arms. NATO would not accept this new reality, but it would not intervene with military, as some are dreaming Russia is very powerful and it maintains excellent relations with most nations on this planet. Does Russia have a legal excuse? Yes, it does, but only in the sad, unfair realm of international politics and agreements. Experts agree that Ukraine has not done enough to fulfill its part of the Minsk Agreement, which was signed in 2015 to ease hostilities in Donbass, and Russia is waving that agreement in the air. Yep, even superpowers have lawyers. The water factor. Russia is also waving another reason for its military buildup near Ukraine. It's not a big enough deal of a reason, at least not big enough to invade the Ukraine. It's the water supply of the Crimea. Russia stated repeatedly that it wants to seize a land corridor to Crimea to ensure the resumption of water flow to the dry peninsula that was cut off in 2014, resulting in a chronic water shortage. Of course, only if Ukraine does not do it voluntarily. Experts agree that such a move by Ukraine can definitely ease the hostilities and give more room and space for talks and negotiations. You might think that the people of Russia and the Ukraine are strangers or hate one another or don't share the same origins. The truth is far from that. There are millions of Ukrainians and Russians who are from the same family's blood relatives, which explains why Ukraine itself is divided on whether to move west towards the EU and NATO. It's applied for membership in both, or east towards what can only be described as their blood family and their descendants. Yes, you heard that right. Most Russians view Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, which was at ancient times the center of the Kievian Rus, as the birthplace of their nation. Russians might as well stop calling Russia the motherland and replace it with the Ukraine as the historical motherland. This fact constitutes an encouraging factor for the Russians to invade, or at least seize some border regions that are very loyal to Russia. Russia will continue its military buildup near the Ukrainian border. Its military plans for the Ukraine cannot be considered as a full invasion plan. Its final decision to seize the border regions within the Ukraine is up in the air and depends on the actions of NATO and the USA. The USA, NATO, and the UK want to continue pressuring Russia as part of their strategy for global economy and securing their interests. The EU is desperately in need of Russia's gas. Russia built Nord Stream 2 to do business and make profits, not to play politics with the EU and NATO. NATO is playing unnecessary games and with fire in the Black Sea. Russia wants water supply from the Ukraine and the Crimea resumed. Turkey is a NATO heavyweight, but a very wild card in this crisis, and it is not on good terms with the EU and the USA. If Russia proceeded with the invasion, it won't happen until late January or February of 2022, and it will merely seize Donbass, which it already controls via proxy loyalists, in addition to seizing a corridor necessary for resuming fresh water flow to Crimea. The historical and family ties between Russia and the Ukraine are stronger than allowing an all-out war to break out. That's it for this video. Farewell, be cool, and stay freaking positive. And if you'd like to stay updated and informed about the latest news topics, hit the subscribe and bell icons. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.